For years, Washington treated Canada as a predictable extension of its own foreign policy, a stable ally, quiet, always aligned. That perception worked as long as the world followed old rules. But it stopped working the moment Canada realized that remaining predictable meant becoming vulnerable. The United States' mistake wasn't diplomatic. It was psychological. The White House began to act as if Canada had no room for its own maneuvering, as if Ottawa only reacted after Washington spoke, as if any disagreement was temporary, negotiable, or symbolic. But something changed, and it wasn't announced in a speech. It didn't come in a press conference. It didn't make headlines. The change began with technical decisions, seemingly neutral, that almost no one outside the strategic circle paid attention to. While public debate in the United States revolved around internal disputes, Canada quietly began to adjust its international stance. Not against the United States, but outside the automatic American orbit. The first sign was ignored. The second was treated as coincidence. The third could no longer be explained as chance. Washington kept looking at Canada through an outdated lens, believing that geographic proximity guaranteed permanent alignment. But proximity isn't submission, and partnership isn't dependency. Canada didn't break away. It repositioned. That difference is fundamental. Countries that break make noise. Countries that reposition change internal rules, expand decision-making margins, and reduce exposure to external pressures, all without triggering immediate shock. And that's exactly what happened. Instead of directly confronting the United States, Canada began diversifying channels, adjusting agreements, redefining strategic priorities. None of this violated treaties. None of this looked hostile. But all of it, step by step, reduced Washington's ability to dictate terms. The problem is that the United States usually only reacts when the impact is already visible. And in this case, when the signs started becoming clear, the movement was already too far along to be reversed with statements or political pressure. The American reading remained based on an old assumption, that Canada would always choose stability over autonomy. But in the current scenario, stability without autonomy became a risk. And Ottawa understood that before Washington. From that point on, the relationship stopped being just a traditional partnership between historical allies. It entered a more complex, more technical, and less emotional phase. Exactly the kind of transition that often goes unnoticed until it brings real consequences. America underestimated Canada because it confused familiarity with control. There was no public rupture. There was no dramatic announcement. There was no direct threat. What happened was something much more serious, a shift in posture. And when a country changes posture without making noise, without asking for permission, and without stepping back afterward, the impact doesn't appear in immediate headlines. It begins backstage, in technical decisions, in quiet agreements, in movements that, when they finally become visible, can no longer be reversed. That's exactly where the U.S.-Canada relationship is now. When the effects began to appear outside the diplomatic field, Washington realized it wasn't dealing with just a one-off disagreement, but with a strategic repositioning already underway. The first consequences didn't appear in official speeches or public statements. They emerged where real power usually manifests first, in economic decisions, silent contracts, logistical adjustments, and alignments that rarely make headlines at first. Canada didn't announce a rupture. It simply began acting as if American predictability was no longer guaranteed. That detail changes everything. For decades, the relationship between the US and Canada operated on a basic assumption. Even when there was political tension, economic, commercial, and strategic foundations would remain intact. That trust allowed for friction without structural cost. What's happening now breaks precisely that pillar. In recent days, Canadian officials have intensified technical conversations with European and Asian partners in areas that traditionally depended on direct integration with Washington. Energy, supply chains, critical technology, and industrial defense began to be handled under a new criterion: reducing dependency. None of this was announced as retaliation. And that's exactly why it was underestimated. While American analysts were still debating public statements and political rhetoric, Canada was advancing in operational agreements. Memorandums of understanding, contract adjustments, and relocation of trade flows began to be implemented quietly but with unusual speed. And other countries noticed. What followed wasn't an isolated reaction, but an observation effect. Traditional US partners began to assess whether Canada's move made sense for them too. Within days, conversations that would normally take months began happening at an accelerated pace. The central point wasn't hostility toward Washington. It was caution. When a historically stable ally starts to reposition, it sends a powerful signal to the international system. It's not an ideological signal. It's an operational alert. Something has changed in the risk calculation. And that's when Washington began to feel the real impact. Inside American federal agencies, internal reports began circulating with different language. Instead of treating the episode as a passing political dispute, analysts began using terms like realignment, loss of predictability, and erosion of indirect influence. Those expressions rarely appear by accident. American influence has always depended less on direct imposition and more on the assumption that aligning with the US was the safest, most stable, and profitable path. When that assumption is questioned even discreetly, the strategic cost is enormous. And that cost began to show up in numbers. Multinational companies with operations in Canada began reviewing projections. Investments planned based on supply chains integrated with the US went under review. There was no mass exodus, but there was a pause. And in the global market, a pause is already a sign of distrust. At the same time, financial centers outside the US began registering increased inquiries related to asset relocation, especially in sectors tied to energy, infrastructure, and advanced technology. None of this shows up in speeches, but all of it shifts the balance of power. In Washington, the initial reaction was disbelief. The dominant view was that Canada had no real incentive to sustain this movement. The logic was simple. Distancing from the US would be too costly. The problem is that this logic comes from a world that no longer exists as it once did. Canada's calculation isn't to abandon the US. It's to not depend exclusively on it. And when that distinction becomes clear, the movement starts to make sense not just for Canada, but for any country observing the scenario with strategic detachment. What began as a specific episode came to be interpreted as a test of how far the US can maintain influence without resorting to explicit pressure. And the early results of that test were not comfortable for Washington. Internally, the debate began to shift in tone. Instead of how to respond, the question became how to regain credibility without escalating the conflict. That's a difficult question. Escalating means risking more damage. Backing down means admitting a loss of influence. And while that dilemma unfolds behind the scenes in America, the external movement continues. Countries that rarely align publicly began adjusting positions in multilateral forums subtly but consistently. Technical votes, joint statements, and speech coordination began to reflect a new caution toward US-led initiatives. It's not open opposition, it's calculated distancing. This kind of shift is more dangerous than direct confrontation because it doesn't create a clear enemy. It simply reduces leadership capacity. And that's exactly what is starting to concern American strategists. The perception that Canada managed to move forward without immediate retaliation set a precedent closely watched by other governments who, for years, had considered similar moves but hesitated out of fear of the consequences. Now, that fear seems smaller. Washington still holds enormous power, military, economic, and political. But power only works fully when others believe it will be used predictably. When that belief weakens, the power remains, but its effectiveness declines. At that point, the situation is no longer about Canada or the United States in isolation. It becomes about the system. What we are witnessing is not a formal rupture, nor an immediate collapse. It's something slower and harder to reverse. The silent redistribution of trust. And trust in the international arena takes years to build and can be shaken far faster than it seems. At this moment, Washington is beginning to realize that the movement underway is not easily reversible in the short term, not because of a lack of strength, but because there is no simple path to restore the sense of stability that once sustained its position. And as this realization takes hold, the world keeps adjusting its pieces one technical decision at a time, far from the spotlight, but with profound consequences.